Fantastic. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for another episode of Confabulating. It's a great pleasure to be joined this evening by Professor Reid of St. Cross College, Oxford, who will be speaking to us on the subject of the relationship between Africa and Europe during the long 19th century. Professor Reid is a historian of modern Africa, specializing in the 19th and 20th centuries, spanning the whole continent, but with a particular focus on East and Northeastern Africa, including Uganda, the Great Lakes, and Ethiopia and Eritrea. He is currently a fellow of St. Cross College, Oxford, and has previously served as a lecturer at SOAS University of London and Durham University. His research has a particular focus on the culture and practice of warfare in the modern period, the transformations of violence in the late pre-colonial period, and recent armed insurgencies from the 1950s to 80s. On those topics, he's written a broad variety of books and articles from 1997 to 2021. His most recent books being A History of Modern Uganda, published in 2017, A History of Modern Africa from 1800 to the Present, published in 2019, and a book entitled Shallow Graves, a memoir of the Ethiopia-Eritrea War, published in 2020. And his most recent articles cover subjects such as Idi Amin's 1971 coup, the Tigray peoples of Ethiopia, atrocity in Ethiopian history, and the Scramble for Africa. His current research looks at war in modern Africa, looking at the historical culture created by violence and the way that it shapes public and private history, as well as how the pre-colonial period is perceived and understood in modern Africa, especially focusing on the negative connotations attached to violence by modern political and economic elite figures. And in addition, he's undertaking a project looking at a re-examination of relationships between Africa and Europe in the long 19th century during the Scramble for Africa from the 1870s to 1910s, and the political, economic, and military upheavals in both continents at the time, which I'm sure we'll be able to learn all about this evening. Professor Reid, thank you very much for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. So this is obviously quite a large topic. So I'm going to flick through some core themes, and I won't bombard everybody with text on my slides, but I'm just going to flag up some images which hopefully capture some of the core ideas that we need to understand when thinking about this relationship. The first thing I should say, just as a preliminary, is that obviously the relationship between Africa and Europe goes back long before the 19th century itself. It goes into antiquity. We know that in some ways this is a long period of mutual invention. Europe begins to perceive Africa in certain ways, particularly during the slave trade, something I'll come to in a second. It's important to remember also that Europe's ideas about Africa also feed into Europe's ideas about itself. And I think one of the things that's often missing from analyses of this relationship is that it is not simply one way. In fact, there is mutual influence and reciprocal ideas about one another. Obviously, in many ways, the story of the relationship itself is one of economics. It's concerned with commercial relationships. This slide demonstrates in fairly kind of straightforward terms the dynamics of the slave trade itself, the so-called famous triangular trade. And this is really in terms of the long 19th century, which, if we allow ourselves a bit of elasticity, really begins in the mid 18th century when the slave trade reaches its height. This is when at least the western side of the continent is being pulled into an Atlantic economy, a very much a global economy, manufactured goods being sold to African societies along the Atlantic seaboard and a little bit in some areas into the interior, for which slaves are received, sent to the Americas, producing things like sugar and cotton, which produces significant levels of profit, which are then fed back into the metropolitan societies. So in many ways, the triangular trade is the beginning of our long 19th century relationship. It's important to note that in many ways, the first major intervention on the part of Europe into African societies is of course, the abolition of the slave trade. This is staggered over a long period of time. Revolutionary France dabbles with it in the 1790s. The British abolished the slave trade. It's important to distinguish, of course, the slave trade from slavery. Slavery is not abolished in the British Empire until the 1830s, but the slave trade is abolished in 1807. And a number of other European countries follow. But as you can see from this map, actually, the slave trade has what has been defined by a number of historians as a slow death. It continues deep into the 19th century, the 1860s, and only really in the 1870s does it begin to disappear significantly. Now that's that relationship. The idea of Africa as a natural place of servitude is tied up with ideas about race and culture, which I'll come to a little bit later. But in terms of our 19th century story, this is really concerned with the transition from the slave trade to what is often termed legitimate commerce. And I always, with my own students, I put legitimate continually in the scare quotes. I won't continue to do that throughout this talk, but legitimate in terms of Europe's idea of what is now legal. And in essence, legitimate commerce is the attempt to wean African societies off the export of human beings and into the production of raw materials. So in many ways, this is the beginnings of Africa's modern economic global history. So the production of cash crops, most notably along the Atlantic seaboard. And this has some interesting side effects. A number of societies are incredibly dynamic in engaging with both the slave trade and legitimate commerce. And the picture on the left of your screen there shows a building in Lagos. Now, this is obviously 20th century, as you can tell from the Volkswagen Beetle in the photo. But the house itself is the kind of architecture that begins to emerge from the middle of the 19th century onwards, in particular coastal towns in West Africa, built by wealthy Afro-Brazilians who are very much part of a European Atlantic world. Often their wealth was initially in the export of slaves, very much engaged in local politics also, but they begin to shift into legitimate commerce, producing palm oil, for example, which essentially lubricated the European Industrial Revolution. And you also get figures like the gentleman on the right, who is a chief in a place called the Pobo, which is in the Niger Delta, Chief Jaja, who actually was a former slave, who goes into this kind of so-called legitimate commerce and begins to produce palm oil for this new Atlantic economy and become very wealthy and powerful in their own right. And in many ways, they are victims of their own success. So dynamic, entrepreneurial are these individuals that eventually the British, in the case of this particular guy, decide that he has to be removed because he's becoming way too powerful in commercial and political terms. So the shift in many ways from the slave trade to legitimate commerce gives rise to new types of economics, new forms of entrepreneurialism, and what we can broadly term social mobility. So someone like Jaja could as a former slave, could actually work his way into the Atlantic economy and become quite powerful. He bought his own freedom and then set up his own kind of chiefdom and so forth. So in many ways, the relationship between Africa and Europe, I suppose if you wanted to take quite a materialistic perspective in the first instance, is really about those commercial shifts and the way that it draws particular African communities into an Atlantic economy. At the same time, we have what I have broadly defined in my own work as something of a kind of political and military revolution within the continent itself. So those global interactions, those interactions with European merchants, with European political representatives, is at least partly responsible for new types of state and society within the continent itself. And we could spend the entire 60 minutes available to us just talking about this alone. But just to give you a sample, obviously on the right, most of us will probably have come across this individual. This is a very famous picture of Shaka, king of the Zulu, who really in many ways embodies the new kind of military revolution, a new way of using war in pursuit of political and economic goals. In the middle this is obviously a contemporary European engraving of soldiers from the kingdom of Buganda in East Africa. Buganda, another state which very much engages with the opportunities opening up in terms of European trade and cultural encounter, in fact, and using their existing political culture to impose themselves on an ever wider area, using war in pursuit of political and economic goals. And on the left of the slide is an individual who's one of my personal favorites when it comes to 19th century African leaders. This guy is called Mirambo. His name meant corpses, so he named himself after the dead. But in fact, he was a remarkable figure in political and commercial terms. He essentially invented his own state, pretty much out of nothing, in what is now sort of central Tanzania. And again, this was very much in response to opportunities presented to him by European and also Indian Ocean commerce. So there is a kind of, there's an upsurge in new forms of state and society within the continent as a result of these global interactions. And it's very important to note that Europeans come to have a particular view of these sorts of leaders. Someone like Shaka, for example, someone like Mirambo, come to be seen not, in fact, as the entrepreneurs that they truly were, but they come to be framed as emblematic, in a way, of Africa's instability and its violence and its savagery. So this is also, therefore, a period of exploration and discovery. So one important thing to point out is that pretty much before the 1850s, it was very difficult for Europeans to stay for long periods of time healthily in much of sub-Saharan Africa. In the 1850s, we get the introduction of quinine, which of course is, has some effects against malaria. And it's really the period in which Europe begins to move beyond the coast into the continent and begins to interact very directly with some of the figures that we've just seen. And I'm highlighting in particular here, both of these images are of Henry Morton Stanley, who was quite a famous explorer of the period. And as many people will know, not an uncontroversial one. The engraving on the left is his famous encounter with the missionary David Livingstone in 1871, a place called Ujiji Kigoma in Central Africa. And this is really a period in which Europeans are wandering in some ways into the continent, realizing themselves in a way. Stanley was a very liminal figure in Victorian society, and in some respects they are pioneers, at least European, in terms of European culture, they're seen as pioneers, but they're very much kind of co-opted, drawn into African society, even though in many ways, as you see from this engraving on the left, they seem to be imposing themselves on African landscapes, and this was very much the image. So you see the US flag being flown as they meet. The main reason why Stanley was flying the American flag, he was actually born in Wales. He was Welsh originally, but his formative years in many ways were in the US. Is that he was instructed by the UK Foreign Office to stop flying the British flag because he was quite a violent individual, as you can tell from the image on the right, where he's proudly holding his gun. This was posed in a London photography studio with his servant Kalulu, is the little boy who died actually soon after this picture was taken. But it's very much in the era in which Europe is discovering the continent and naming places and finding rivers and lakes. And again, if you like, the sort of proto-imperialism of the late 19th century is really about mapping the landscape and judging the societies that they encountered. A key bit of this, of course, is the Civilizing Mission. Stanley was not a missionary, but he very much believed that he was someone who was forging the way for those evangelical movements that were very much resurgent in the course of the 19th century, and a core part of Europe's interaction with Africa in the long 19th century is through missionary work. This is a fairly classic representation of missionaries kind of saving Africans from themselves. This becomes increasingly the kind of underpinning notion of what Europe's role is in what Stanley termed the dark continent, that in fact souls were important, all souls were important, and it was certainly critical to save these particular benighted individuals. So you get lots of kind of missionaries beginning to move into the continent, particularly from the 1850s, 1860s onwards. Their success is very limited, it has to be said. In the previous slide, I mentioned David Livingstone, who's perhaps the most famous missionary of this period. Livingstone is one of the least successful missionaries you can imagine. Essentially, he makes one convert, a guy who then kind of relapses later on and changes his mind. So it's quite ironic that Livingstone is kind of held up to be this champion of the civilizing mission, but is actually a terrible missionary himself. But certainly by the 1870s, 1880s, you get a very large number of mission stations moving beyond the coast into the interior. Now, underpinning all of this are shifting ideas about race and culture. And what is interesting is you begin to move from someone of the stature of this individual. This is the Reverend Samuel Kreider, who was actually the first Anglican bishop of Equatorial Africa. And he was a freed slave who was resettled in Sierra Leone, and later on worked in what became Nigeria. And part of the civilizing mission was the idea, at least up until the kind of mid-19th century, was that Africans could be saved. They could be made into something that at least replicated European ideas about culture and religion. And one of the most interesting shifts in terms of the relationship between Africa and Europe in this period is the move between the idea, from the idea that you could have someone like Bishop Kreider actually leading the civilizing mission on behalf of Europe, to this kind of idea, which is the infantilization of the continent, that in fact, Africans are not capable of saving themselves. And this is, this particular image is a very famous cartoon from a satirical magazine called Punch in the late 19th century. And John Bull, of course, as many of you will know, is the embodiment, personification of England. And in this picture, of course, he's running an orphanage, and another little baby is dumped on the doorstep. This one happens to be Uganda. And you get this hardening of racial ideas that, in fact, the African is childlike and is not capable of self-development and self-realization. Now, these ideas, perhaps we can discuss in the Q&A exactly where they come from, but they certainly form the cultural framework for the partition itself. And of course, any discussion of Europe and Africa's relationship in the long 19th century culminates in the idea of the partition, the conquest, what we now call in shorthand, the scramble for Africa. The map on the left is just to kind of indicate, as late as 1870, the extent to which the continent is still very much in African hands. We look closely at it, there are little entrepôts, little pockets of European and foreign influence on the coast, but almost always confined to the coast. Whereas there are these large, sophisticated state-level societies across the continent in the 1870s. On the right is a contemporary representation of the Conference of Berlin in 1884-85. You can see the map of Africa there in the background. Most of the gentlemen, and they're all gentlemen, sitting around the table had no idea, what societies existed within the continent. They were simply carving it up for diplomatic purposes. So the partition on the map, and actually this is perhaps an even better representation, certainly more colorful one, 1880, major states and societies within the continent. The reason why there's lots of kind of gray areas in between those colorful bits, by the way, is that if you actually try to represent the massive diversity within the continent, it would simply be inexplicable. But that's just to give some idea of the level of sovereignty, which is still exercised by African societies, even in 1880. And yet within a generation, we come to the map on the right. Now, we know, of course, that cartography is often very mendacious, and maps are simply representations often of wishful thinking. But certainly by 1900, what we have is basically the map on the right, where pretty much the entire continent has been partitioned in the name of the civilizing mission, in the name of progress, with two exceptions, which you may or may not be able to make out on this particular map. One is over on the left, Liberia in West Africa, which is nominally at least an independent state, although in many ways it's an American vassal protectorate. And on the right-hand side of the map, you have Ethiopia, of course, which was the only African state to actually successfully repulse a European invasion. The process of partition itself, the process of conquest of the scramble, is an interesting coalescence of both violence on the part of Europeans, the rather grisly image. This is a postcard actually that was, these kinds of images were produced by colonial authorities to almost commemorate the crushing of rebellion. And the individuals being hanged in this picture were in fact rebels from the what was known as the Maji uprising in German East Africa. So we know that the European invasion was often extremely violent, and in some cases, of course, genocidal, as was the case in German Southwest Africa. And yet it also involved the co-option of African soldiers. So in fact, the period of partition, this culmination of this relationship between Europe and Africa actually depends very, very heavily on African personnel. And the soldiers you see here in this image are actually from the King's African Rifles, which was one of the more famous British regiments in British East Africa. And so it was very rare, in fact, for large numbers of European soldiers to serve in terms of the conquest of Africa. Most of the conquest was actually done by African personnel. So you have this curious juxtaposition, I guess, between the violence of the colonial order and yet also at the same time the co-option of African personnel in actually carrying out the partition itself. But it's also worth asking ourselves, who's co-opting who, in a way? Because what we also know is that many of the African political elites that have been very successful in reforming and revolutionizing their own societies in the course of the 19th century are very heavily involved in creating the colonial order. And so this is just a selection of images. Top left, this is actually the old white gentleman in the middle of that picture is Lord Lugard, Frederick Lugard, who was one of the architects of the British colonial order. This is him visiting London Zoo, believe it or not, with the emirs of the Sultanate of Sokoto, which was a big Islamic state in West Africa. They came over to London to visit. What do you do if anybody's visiting London? You take them to London Zoo, and this is what he does in the 1920s. But Lugard very much set up the idea that you ruled through African chiefs. This was the principle behind indirect rule, which both in different ways various colonial regimes actually practiced. But it was also the case that African rulers themselves in many ways co-opted Europeans into their own political orders. And we see this, the top right image, one of my favorites. This is the Asantehene of the Kingdom of Ashanti in West Africa with the serving governor at that time. And if you look at this picture, it's kind of hard to know who's really in charge. The King of Ashanti looks a lot more confident than the rather nervous looking British colonial governor. And the picture in the middle is a sort of classic representation. This is from Uganda, but it shows the sort of layers of colonial society, of colonial hierarchy. The young boy to the right of the picture is the child king of a kingdom called Buganda. He's surrounded, of course, by colonial officials, but behind him are African regents, African chiefs who have actually, in many ways, helped design the colonial order that shapes what we know as Uganda today. So in many ways, I think it's important to remember this relationship culminates in a series of mutual co-options in many respects. And finally, I just want to mention ideas about aftermath and memory. The relationship between Africa and Europe in the long 19th century is a dynamic one. It culminates, of course, in the Scramble, in Partition. But it's important to remember, to keep in mind how it has been remembered, how it is framed in terms of memory, both in Europe and in Africa. In this image, this is an Ethiopian painting from around 1940, commemorating the successful victory of the Ethiopians over the Italian invasion. As I mentioned earlier, Ethiopia is the only state that successfully repulses a European invasion. And it's very much, it becomes symbolic, not just for Ethiopia, but in fact, in time for the whole of Africa, that here is an African state that successfully pushes back a European invasion. And this picture is wonderful. It's in many ways, it's a terrific representation of Ethiopian art. If you look closely, you'll see that in fact, the Italians who are on the right-hand side and their native soldiers, who are all from Eritrea, are seen in side profile to show that they are not pure. This is kind of, I suppose, in a sense, kind of like medieval European art. On the left-hand side, however, the Ethiopian army is all seen, their faces are full on. This great victory is celebrated throughout the 20th century. And comes to kind of resonate with African nationalists. Likewise, in many ways, the partition itself, ideas about conquest, ideas about African dynamism are commemorated in other ways. Narratives of victimhood are very important. So at the top left, we see a king called Kabalega, who was the ruler of a kingdom called Banyoro, which is also in the Uganda protectorate, whose kingdom is decimated by the British in the 1890s. And this still today, I mean, I've worked in this particular neighborhood, and people remember still 130 years on the devastations that were inflicted on them at the end of the 19th century. They become an important part of collective memory. Here on the right-hand side, we have a memorial set up, in fact, to Jaja, who I mentioned early on in Nigeria, as a great entrepreneur, a great kind of state builder, surrounded by his cannons there and so forth. And this is a very important part of later nation building within Africa itself. But of course, finally, within Europe, I couldn't speak to you from Oxford without mentioning our friend Cecil Rhodes, who is, of course, the cause of a great deal of controversy ongoing within the university. And it's interesting that Rhodes himself, of course, recently, through the Rhodes Must Fall movement, has once again become the focus of a great deal of activism. On the right-hand side, we see his statue, which I have to say is still there on High Street, just a little way from where I'm speaking tonight. And it's within Europe in the last 10, 15 years, you still get these debates about the nature of empire, the nature of conquest. In many ways, the perception of Africa itself, still very live, still very controversial. I think it's fair to say that particularly since Brexit, these kinds of debates have enlivened and become even more heated. So even a century on from the period under examination, people are still looking at what that relationship meant. And they're coming at it from a range of different angles. And perhaps I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Professor. So I think there are so many different questions and angles that we could approach this from. But one which I wanted to ask, which I think you picked up on earlier in the discussion, is the remarkable turn from believing, this idea that the African continent could be civilized by missionaries, going to this idea of more infantilizing them, I suppose, and just kind of giving up on that civilizing mission and starting the more sort of territorial takeover of the country. Out of curiosity, why do you think that change came about? And there was that kind of quite big swing from kind of one idea to another?
Great question. I think you can identify a moment. I would suggest it's probably in the 1860s. Remember that, you know, this is a moment in the 1860s where ideas about race and development are very live. You've had the Indian uprising in the 1850s, which has given rise to ideas about, you know, whether, you know, the native can be truly civilized. Can we trust them? What's the nature of the civilizing mission? This has shocked the British Empire, and these ideas are imported into Africa. You have an uprising in Jamaica, of course, in the 1860s, which is very violent, and again raises questions about, you know, racial identity. And of course, you've got the American Civil War, which in many ways is fundamentally, of course, about race and rights. And it kind of coalesces, I think, in the 1860s in particular, where you've got a number of people coming to the conclusion that although the slave trade has been abolished, and you know, half a century earlier, and there's been this belief that Africans could be saved, they could be helped to save themselves. The persistence of the so-called illegal slave trade, and the rise of violence within the continent, and the rise of various types of warlord type figures gives rise to the notion that Africa is actually beyond salvation unless you intervene directly. So I think really that's the shift that happens, and of course, you know, there's also the creeping emergence of racial pseudoscience, which you can date back to the early 19th century. In many ways, Darwin kind of contributes to it through this idea of a hierarchy and survival of the fittest and so on. Darwin himself doesn't really contribute very much to racial science, or pseudoscience, I should say, but it kind of caps those ideas that there is in fact a hierarchy, and this hierarchy can be discerned through behaviors, and I think you get that shift in the 1860s. That's the moment when there's this real belief that the only way that the African can be saved is through direct intervention. That at least creates the framework for what becomes later the partition itself.
I see, that's really fascinating. Thank you. It sort of just having heard that, it sort of strikes me as almost a sort of insecurity in Europe, that, you know, they've faced all of these rebellions, all of these kind of initially, if you could call them benign ideas of kind of civilizing other parts of the world, seems to have broken down. And there's, I guess, this sort of idea mixed in with that kind of racist pseudoscience, that the only kind of viable path is through kind of quite direct conquest. That certainly, as an outsider to this topic, that certainly seems to me to be the way that things develop. Would you say that that's fair, or do you think there are already kind of ideas in place that kind of pave the way for that quite sort of violent takeover of the continents in the period?
I think it's clear that violence has long attended colonial enterprise. I mean, rightly, I mean, we know this going back to the discovery of the Americas, and the devastations inflicted in the 16th century. There's nothing particularly unique about what happens in the late 19th century. What I would I would argue that there's the hardening of racial ideas introduces a racial element, I think, to the violence, which is perhaps not quite as overt in earlier iterations of European empire building. And I'd certainly agree that this is, as much as anything else, about Europe's own neuroses, its own insecurities. I mean, what's actually quite interesting is that in the 1890s, 1900s, in fact, if you look at sort of poetry, particular types of literature in the period, it's really quite glum. It's not triumphalist. I mean, one of the the great poets of British imperialism, for example, Rudyard Kipling. You know, I mean, one of his most famous ones is The White Man's Burden, right? Which is about the American, not about Africa at all. It's about the American conquest of the Philippines. But it's kind of held to be a kind of anthem for the period. It's actually quite kind of pessimistic, and you know, it's a sort of heavy burden that Europe has to intervene. It's almost a sign of, you know, sad desperation. And I think the otherization, the hardening of ideas around objectifying the African really say much more about Europe's own fears about the world and the world that it doesn't really understand, for all its ability to map and impose coordinates and to name mountain ranges and lakes, is actually really about its own anxieties. And it's worth keeping in mind that the second half of the 19th century, of course, is a period of incredible turmoil within Europe itself. So it's not that Europe is kind of going forth with absolute confidence into the world. This is why I flagged up someone like Stanley, who in many ways is symptomatic of this. Stanley grows up an orphan. He's dislocated by industrial society. He's desperate for acceptance and so forth. So although he kind of violently he shoots his way across the continent and does lots of killing and imposing, in fact, he's a very small, frightened individual, as many Europeans are in this period.
I see. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Thank you very much. I'd now like to invite Guillermo to ask our next question.
I have a question that can be a little polemic, I think, but Professor, do you think that the modern world, this globalization that we live on, is like a daughter, you can say, to the history of colonization? It's the result of the colonization. Do you think that, or?
That is such a huge question. I mean, it's often. I think you can make that argument. Yeah. There is a debate within my own faculty here, which is about the nature of what is global history. Is global history another way of thinking about what used to simply be called imperial history? And there's no doubt that, you know, in terms of discipline, the historical discipline and methodology, one definitely grows out of the other. I'm not sure. Yeah, so one of the arguments would be, yes, that globalization is in fact, it needs to be understood as part and parcel of empire building and the kind of relationship that we've dealt with tonight. I tend to think of it not so much in terms of that colonialism is necessarily always involved in globalization. You don't need necessarily to have colonization or empire building. I do think that what the relationship between Africa and Europe shows in the 19th century is that globalization, global connections, is almost always violent at some level, and the ways that violence manifests itself may be quite diverse. But there's no question that it is not some kind of smooth sort of developmental sequence of events. It actually, it does involve violence, and I would say up to and including colonial conquest. But it's not, it also involves, as I've tried to make the case for tonight, it also involves reciprocal cooption. It involves local groups also trying to take advantage of the opportunities on offer through these dynamics. But I mean, I think you could certainly argue in a simpler answer to your question. I think you can certainly argue that it is very difficult to imagine globalization without the kinds of imperial violence and the empire building that we see in the 18th and 19th centuries.
I have another question that is around Liberia, because normally we think that the United States didn't have anything about the Scramble for Africa and so on, but Liberia emerges as a, like you said, a vassal to the United States. So we can say that even the United States participated a little bit in the Scramble for Africa because of Liberia.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would go further actually. So Liberia is one thing, and of course Liberia is created. You know, it's nominally given its independence in 1847, and very similar to the British version, of course, was Sierra Leone. These are territories which are artificially created as homes for intercepted and freed slaves, and in some cases, you know, a kind of an early form of the Back to Africa movement. So they long predate the Scramble for Africa. But research is just now, I think, really getting underway on the American role in the Scramble for Africa. And it's not something I work on myself, but I do know that there's an American footprint pretty much everywhere. American companies are very heavily involved, for example, in the commercial opening up of Africa in the late 19th century. We get US representatives kind of rebuilding the Egyptian army. You get American adventurers. Stanley himself, of course, is kind of, you know, is sort of semi-American. So I think you're absolutely right. There is an American presence which often goes unnoticed. You know, there is this tendency to see this purely as a European thing, when in fact Europe, of course, is the majority stakeholder. Let's say, but there are other societies involved, including the Ottoman Empire, India itself, even as a colonial society. India is very much involved in terms of opening up East Africa, and there is an American involvement, and I actually very much look forward to seeing the work being produced by colleagues who I know are beginning to look where is the US? We know what's happening in Central America. We know what's happening in the Philippines, but the Americans are there in the late 19th century in Africa. Absolutely.
Yes, because I read some time ago that President Ulysses Grant I don't know what was the question. I think it was the question about Bulama in Guinea-Bissau, but I don't think is that or Cabinda, but in Angola. But he sided with the Portuguese in a matter of territorial question with the French. I think it was Cabinda. So I was linking that episode with Liberia because of that. Because people don't know, people even in Portugal don't know about that. So yeah.
Yes, absolutely, and it's worth. There are all sorts of kind of narratives around America's sort of image of itself, of course, as the epitome of anti-colonialism itself, because you know there's this narrative that it is the most successful anti-colonial uprising in world history. But it's worth remembering, of course, that through much of the 20th century, in fact, the US very much underwrote European empires. Even under someone like Roosevelt in the 1930s, 1940s, very keen to publicly criticize, or at least, wag the finger at European empires, but privately supportive of many of the objectives. And I think in some ways that narrative has obscured America's own role in the continent in an earlier period. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'd like to move now, if it's all right, from Liberia to the other kind of more independent part of Africa, which is, of course, Ethiopia. And I'm curious, why do you think it was able to stay independent even towards the end of the 19th century?
There's an old debate about whether was it an Italian failure or an Ethiopian success, right? And I think that kind of debate is often kind of slightly racially laced, if I can put it that way, because it's sort of, well, the Ethiopians didn't really win. It was just that the Italians were rubbish and they were quite unconvincing empire builders. I think it's a combination of the two. The Italians massively underestimated Ethiopian strength. And it's worth remembering, of course, that the Italians had actually sold to the Ethiopians most of their guns. So they shouldn't have been that surprised when they came up against an army which was actually incredibly well armed. The other debate, of course, within Ethiopia is not, they were very, very good. They were assiduous throughout the late 19th century at importing pretty much modern weaponry. But this idea that Ethiopia was able to marshal a much larger force, a kind of proto-nationalism that you don't see in other parts of the continent, even among those militarily successful societies such as the Zulu. But Ethiopia was able to kind of mobilize this sense of itself as a relatively ancient civilization. I think there was some truth in that also. I mean, basically, in the 1890s, the Ethiopians could put more than 100,000 soldiers in the field. The Italians invaded with about 20,000. Yeah, so it's that kind of inequity. But it's kind of worth bearing in mind that there's also just briefly within Ethiopia, with Ethiopian studies, this debate whether or not Ethiopian nationalism led to the Battle of Adwa, or did the Battle of Adwa lead to Ethiopian nationalism? And I think you could equally argue both. But there was no question that the Italians massively underestimated Ethiopian strength.
That's really interesting to know. Thank you. I'd like to ask sort of more broadly as well. I think we've talked a lot about sort of how Europeans viewed Africa and how that reflected on their own kind of psyche and sense of self. But do we have any evidence about sort of what Africans thought of like Europeans coming into, their sort of various homelands and interfering in the way that they did? And if so, what kind of things did they pick up on?
Terrific question. For the earlier part of the century, the sources are very limited. So we do get glimpses of what Africans think of Europeans. In some ways, it's problematic because those voices are often filtered through European sources. Yeah, so you'll have European accounts which will be claiming to quote an African king or a merchant, and you get this quite a lot from the late 18th century onwards. What we do know is that in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, Africans very often go into print, particularly literate Muslim and Christian Africans begin to write down stuff and articulate views. And very often within the colonial order, there will be kind of implied criticism of particular European initiatives, but very often they're not really that concerned with that. They're more concerned with forcefully making the case for why particular groups should be privileged within the colonial order above others. And there are a number of cases where you get Africans articulating kind of ethnic identity, for example, because they believe that that's actually quite a good thing to do within this within the, you know, by the 1910s, 1920s, in the wake of the Scramble, they're writing history in a sense to make claims within the colonial order itself. If that makes, if that answers your question. I mean, you don't get in this period, you don't get really overt criticisms in print by Africans of the European order, but more the staking of claims to political authority and political influence, really.
See, yeah, so it's sort of like almost kind of making their claim at the system and saying, you know, I deserve, you know, to get sort of special treatment because of my my background.
Exactly. And there are cases in which, you know, bearing in mind that very often these are Christian converts, so they're basically writing these kind of historical stroke political tracts very much in the style of the Bible. So, you know, you get lots of smiting and, you know, they're getting trials and tribulations of particular communities. But they're written in such a way as to almost sanctify the community. So it's quite difficult to kind of, you need to read these sources very closely to understand where is the critique, where's the kind of anti-colonial critique, as opposed to simply using the Bible as a way of kind of writing history and then making a political claim. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, that's really very interesting, because I suppose I would have presupposed that there would have been more sort of overt criticisms. But it's interesting that there's also these kind of attempts to kind of, I suppose for want of a better phrase, kind of ingrain themselves into the system, but, you know, kind of stake their claims and stratify themselves above other people. That's something that's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, the overt criticisms come in time, but they come by the sort of 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, rather than in this period. And very often it is the case that you get, the criticisms are often kind of coded in a sense. They're embedded within African culture. It's not that you don't, you know, and you get in popular songs and so forth, you know, insults, you know, Europeans being insulted. But in terms of, you know, Africans kind of writing things down and actually making coherent arguments, that comes a lot later on.
I see. It's really interesting, thank you. And I suppose another thing which really interested me about sort of particularly the more sort of early period, and indeed into the later one, is the way that some sort of African elites were able to kind of leverage sort of European influence and control, like we saw with the Ashanti. I'd be interested if you could perhaps expand on that a bit further. Like, are there any sort of examples of particular rulers or communities doing that particularly well? Or being able to kind of leverage European influence to their advantage. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean there are many. I mean, arguably, one I mentioned earlier, the Sokoto Caliphate, which still exists as a kind of religious unit, at least in West Africa and northern Nigeria. They do a very skillful job, and you know the British essentially conquer them. You know, by around 1903. But the British then recognized that actually we can't really govern this area without their support, and the emirs of the Sokoto Caliphate are very clever at bringing the British in and saying, yeah, you know, leave it to us, we'll raise the taxes, we'll do this, that, and the other. And one area, I mean, that I've done, you know, primary research in Uganda. Even today, within, you know, the whole territory is named after one kingdom, which is the kingdom of Buganda. And the Baganda will say today that they were not conquered. They were partners to the British. They were never conquered. They invited the British in and they decided to work with the British. And actually, in many ways, you know, the situation is a bit more complicated than that in reality, but there's no question that the Ganda political elite were very skillful at understanding that the British did have guns, but they were also pretty weak and they were pretty vulnerable and they could be manipulated. And you see this in the kind of close reading of colonial officials' diaries in the 1890s when they were conquering around the surrounding areas. And they were very reliant on Buganda's advice and support. And Uganda would say, oh, I wouldn't attack this month because the river is quite high. It's the rainy season. Let's wait until next month. And the British would then wait. And they would kind of be advised by these various commanders, local army chiefs, military chiefs, to kind of in terms of how they would conduct the actual conquest. So I mean, there, you know, that's just a couple of examples, but there's no doubt that colonial rule would not have happened, could not have happened without the kind of interaction of the role of that kind of agency at the local level.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah. I have so many more questions, and I'm sure that our audience do as well, but I'm afraid we've just about hit time, which is a real pity, but there we are. So, Professor Reid, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's been a really fascinating discussion. And I'd like to thank everybody watching as well. Hope you've enjoyed it, and see you in the next episode. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thanks very much.
Good
Thank you.
evening.